Of that other country we now speak, the land of yellow earth and blue sky, where a golden emperor once ruled. My grandmother lived in that land. In the mornings, she bathed in a river where a green dragon once played, where a sad poet drowned, reaching for the moon one night. That my grandmother had stolen the moon. She had scooped the moon into her wooden bowl and hidden it inside an earthen jar, where it remains to this day. It is the curse of that poor poet that has plagued our family ever since, that has followed us across many rivers and oceans. My grandmother left the moon back in the old country. For 10 years, the moon rested inside her earthen jar and grew heavy. For 10 years, the night sky over her village remained moonless. When the time came for her to give the moon back to the river, so that the moon shadow could once more be seen over the sky, the soldiers arrived. She said they were looking for the green dragon that played in the old river. For it is said, the one who rides the green dragon shall rule over the land of 10,000 sorrows. But the absence of moonlight saddened the soldiers that night. They could not remember the faces of their mothers, wives, and children. Their sadness turned to anger, and they drove the villagers out of their homes. Before she fled, my grandmother took her jar to the family crypt and buried it beside her grandmother. She promised to return for it, but her family placed her on a boat which sailed farther away. That is the tale she told me as a child. That is the story I remember. So that's the beginning of the title story in this latest collection of mine, Of That Other Country We Now Speak. I am Charlson Ong, and I write fiction in English. I've been doing it for over 30 years, since the early 1980s when I was much younger. I have 3 previous collections of short stories, Men of the East, and Other Stories, which was reviewed by Time magazine when it first came out in 1990. Woman of Amkaw and Other Stories, and Conversion and Other Fictions. I have written 3 novels, An Embarrassment of Riches, which won second prize in the Philippine Centennial Literary Competition in 1998. Banyaga, A Song of War, and Blue Angel, White Shadow, that both won the National Book Award. Banyaga is a historical novel, and Blue Angel is crime fiction. I also teach writing at the Department of English and Comparative Literature at the UP. So I will tell you a bit about what I write, how, and maybe why. I write mostly about Chinese Filipinos. I do so because that is my own background, and I believe a fiction writer should proceed from a place he knows, not just intellectually, but existentially. Somehow, you must have lived your fiction. I base a lot of my fiction on tales that I grew up with. Stories told to me as a child by my grandmother, my parents, relatives, friends. So to young and beginning writers, always listen to family and neighborhood gossip. I also base certain characters on individuals I've known from way back, people who have touched me somehow. This is my way of paying tribute to them, as well as to other writers and works that have influenced me. For instance, my story, How My Cousin Manuel Brought Him a Wife, included in the anthology Best Philippine Short Stories, edited by Dr. Isagani Cruz, is a tribute to the classic story of Manuel Argilia, How My Brother Leon Brought Him a Wife, that I first read in high school. But while Argilia's story concerns an adolescent boy whose elder brother brings home to the province a young wife from the big city, Manila, my story is about a young man whose long-lost cousin brings home a wife all the way from Brazil to Manila's Chinatown. When Argilia wrote his story in the 1930s, most Filipinos still lived in rural areas, and bringing home a city-born wife was a big deal. When I wrote mine in the 1990s, most Filipinos lived in towns and cities, and many worked abroad and had foreign spouses. Time alters the context of stories, but the human issues remain constant. How do we live? How do we love? My story was inspired by an occasion in my boyhood when a family friend invited us to a party to celebrate the return of her brother from years of foreign sojourn. She said he was coming home with his Brazilian wife. I was excited to meet my first Brazilian, who turned out to be this tall, hefty, white woman who spoke mostly Portuguese. I thought back then it was Spanish. It was a strange, happy occasion. But I wondered even then how it would have been if the wife had turned out instead to be a hefty African Brazilian. Would the family have hosted the party as well? How would the guy's China-born mother have reacted? Traditionally, many Chinese people were biased against darker-skinned people. Fairness was highly valued in traditional society, fetishized. Brides were supposed to be petite and fair-complexioned, even bound feet in earlier times. Stories are about what-ifs, about conflicts spawned by the unexpected and the absurd. So I had my protagonist bring home an African-Brazilian wife to comedic and life-changing consequences. Another often anthologized story of mine is the execution. It concerns the execution of the man legally known as Lim Seng, who was the only person officially executed under martial law, and its consequences on a fictional Chinese family. Lim was arrested soon after the declaration of martial law in September 1972 and charged with trafficking in narcotics. I was 12 years old when he was executed by musketry in Fort Bonifacio, and I saw the event on television. I remember the varied reactions of family and friends, the debates. When school reopened, a classmate told me how his father awakened him during the dawn of the execution and brought him to see it live. It was open to the public. It surprised and bothered me that anyone would want to watch someone else, a stranger in fact, killed, and to even bring his son along. Of course, executions as that of Dr. Jose Rizal used to be public spectacles. But the fact that my classmate was also Chinese Filipino deepened my wonderment. Why? I asked myself. I wrote the story many years later to answer my own query, in a way. The stories we write are often answers as well to some of the deepest questions that trouble us. In the end, they may help others too answer their own. Contemporary fiction can also be inspired by folktale, legend, including urban legend. Again, decades ago, there were persistent rumor that some dumplings being sold downtown contained other than pork or beef. They were supposedly stuffed with cat meat or other exotic material. I used this idea for a story called A Tropical Winter's Tale, about a wife from China who finally gets fed up with her oppressive husband and deals with him in a savory manner, quote unquote. Current events, especially those that impact us personally, can also generate fiction. The killing of countless protesters in Tiananmen Square in June 1989 spurred me to write Trouble in Beijing, that won first prize in the Palanga contest in 1994. It was also my way of finally mourning my father, who had died of heart failure in 1987. I was actually relieved he had not lived long enough to witness those events that I knew would have pained him deeply. Our stories are records of our own passing. They cannot help but be of our time, even if we set them in the past or in the future, and of our own place, even if we set them in alien territory. Quite often, in fact, we use places that we've been to in our writing. In 1986, after the EDSA uprising, I became jobless. I spent time working in Taipei. One night, there was a big earthquake that felled an old building. It occurred before dawn. When I rushed out to the veranda of our dormitory, expecting to see many people in the streets as in Manila, I saw no one. It was winter, and the street was eerily cold and hurting, and quiet. It struck me that the city was hurting. A line came to me. The night we met, the city was in pain. Something told me that I would make use of that line someday, so I tucked it away, and sometime later, when I returned home, I used it as the opening line of my story, Another Country, that won a prize in the Asia Week Short Story Competition. It was based on my experiences in Taipei. Again, I always tell students, keep those lines that come to you in the middle of the night or in unexpected moments. You never know when you will need them. It's your own subconscious at work. Beginning a story is half the job done. To remember and to sing, that, says national artist Nick Joaquin in his classic drama, Portrait of the Artist as Filipino, is the writer's vocation. Memory is vital. We remember as individuals, as communities, as nations. To lose one's memory is to lose oneself. To remember is to be free. For me, Philippine literature is an ever-growing banquet, a buffet. Anyone who wants to engage in it should ask himself or herself, what do I bring to the table? In my first novel, in 1998, it was time for the celebration of the Philippine Centennial. I wanted to write a novel that would locate the Philippines' imagined community in Southeast Asia. Our literature, especially in English, has always traced nationhood to Spanish and Catholic colonization. This is inevitable, of course, and valid. We also write under the shadow of Jose Rizal. But I wanted to write the other story, that of South Chinese emigration to Nanyang, or the South Seas, that played a vital role in the formation of nation-states. In the Philippines, this led to the formation of the Sanglai Ilustrado class at the turn of the last century, and to the present-day Chinoy and Taipan class of citizens. The result was an embarrassment of riches. It is set in a fictional Pacific island called the Victorianas that closely resembles the Philippines. After the island's dictator dies, elections are called. The narrator, Jeffrey Kennedy Tantibo, a Chinese Victorian in self-exile in the Philippines, is summoned home by his friend, Jennifer Suarez C., the daughter and heiress to the island nation's richest, Taipan. They own Megalomolia, a vast cradle-to-grave emporium that employs most of the island's inhabitants. Jennifer is running for president and wants Jeffrey to help her. After she wins, Jennifer transfers the presidential office to Megalomolia, as per advice of her feng shui master. This sparks an uprising that leads to her downfall. Megalomolia becomes a war zone. Malls were beginning to dominate the cityscape when I began writing the book, and continue to be the site of some of our fiercest contestations. The novel is a satire on the dysfunction during the Cory Aquino years, when government was ripped by dissension, as well as an exploration of ethnic and political identity. The main character, Jeffrey Tantibo, writes, this is the... Okay. There is perhaps a nagging suspicion among our elders that we may have found another country, a country to live in and die for, that offers sustenance but demands commitment and sacrifice. A focus for youthful passion, luring us away from more mundane and safer concerns of commerce and clan. A country that again dangles the promise of martyrdom, which only ends in betrayals. All, that is, that an exile must at least partially abandon when he abandons home. Never again, he tells himself, and admonishes his children. This is not our war or yours. We fought ours many seasons ago, so you may live in peace. At some point, the migrant knows that he must choose fully to live fully as a person without country, if only to survive the vicissitudes of uprootedness. He bends with the wind and profits on cynicism. He says no to everything that forced him to leave home and family, war and patriotism. He dreams that his children will be citizens of the world. It is a pipe dream, of course, for one cannot love humanity without sympathizing with a neighbor brutalized by systemic oppression. Because nationalism is only the concrete expression of our humanity in a particular time and place. This he knows. He knows in his heart of exile that his children are no longer his children. He knows this dream of unbelonging is the last thing he must surrender with grace to time. Geography is destiny, and our proximity to China has always been boon and bane. The novel, written 20 years ago, somehow prefigures some of the issues we now face in dealing with a giant neighbor. My second novel, Banyaga, A Song of War, delves into nearly a century of Philippine history, but from the point of view of the Chinese community. It begins at sea and ends at sea. In the 1920s, 4 Chinese boys meet on a boat from Xiamen to Manila and become sworn brothers. They become patriarchs of clans and of diverse fates and fortunes. The book spans the period before the Second World War, the war years, post-war reconstruction, the martial law period, and ends with EDSA. My third novel, Blue Angel, White Shadow, is crime fiction. It begins with the death of a 25-year-old lounge singer, Doris Aldiaga, in her room at the Blue Angel Cafe and Bar in Binondo. Inspector Cyrus Ledesma, a Chinese mestizo cop with a dark past, is assigned to investigate the matter. Ledesma digs up evidence that implicates the bar owner, the mayor, and the police chief. The book is also my tribute to a side of Manila that is fast fading. I write fiction in English because most of my influences are works in English, and it is the language I feel most comfortable using, although I also write in Filipino for other media. But I also claim another reason for writing in English, and that is I use it as a representative language, since my characters often speak in a mishmash of different tongues, Chinese languages, Philippine languages, and English. When I started out writing, there were few outlets, since we were still under authoritarian rule. Most prominent writers then wrote for theater, and I too wanted to be a playwright. But I realized that if I wanted to be authentic, I would have to use Filipino or Tagalog the way immigrant Chinese spoke it. That is, the way my own grandmother spoke it. And that was a sensitive matter back then. It was how Chinese people were often caricatured in mass media. When I was a boy, there was a character on television named Akong. He was played by a fellow named Bert Delfino, who was a drummer, I remember, for a band. And he was always decked out in costume, with his Ming Dynasty cap. He even had a pigtail. But he was often a friendly, if miserly, neighborhood store owner in a sitcom called Kwentong Kutsero that featured an array of comic caricatures, including an English-touting Ilocano lawyer and a gay gossip. Aside from occasional overpricing, Akong was generally a benign character. I was amused by him and enjoyed the show, but my grandmother disliked it, and I would switch channels whenever she was around. Later, I realized that her dislike stemmed from the fact that she was the one being caricatured by that character. I, on the other hand, I spoke Tagalog fluently as a local born and identified with the majority audience. Up to my adolescence, Akong was the only representation of the Philippine Chinese on local television. There was none in the movies that I can remember. Then in 1975, the late national artist Lino Broca came out with his classic Maynila sa mga kuko ng liwanag, based on Edgardo Reyes' novel. Much of it is set in Chinatown. It starred the young Hilda Coronel as the ill-fated Ligaya Paraiso, who is recruited from the province to work in Manila and ends up kept woman of the lecherous Chinese Atek in Binondo. Atek is played by a real Chinese person. Her hometown beau, Julio Madiaga, played by a debuting Bembol Rocco, comes to find her and experiences the seedy side of the city. Julio later blames Atek for Ligaya's death and avenges her by murdering Atek in his entresuelo using an ice pick. He is then lynched by the mob. It is a gruesome, horrific murder scene that shocked me as an adolescent. First time a local Chinese is depicted on the big screen, and he is slaughtered like an animal. I'd love to write, even as a schoolboy, but that cinematic experience spurred me in a big way. Between the caricature that was Akong and the villain Atek, there was a whole array of local Chinese characters, a whole bunch of stories that needed telling. Atek must not be the end of it, I decided. Just as Quiroga, the opportunistic Chinese merchant in Rizal's El Filibusterismo, is not an unfair representation of the Chinese of that time, only an incomplete one. There was, after all, a real-life immigrant Chinese, Jose Ignacio Paua, who joined the revolution as a general in Aguinaldo's army. Then in 1976, national artist Eddie Romero came out with his Ganito Kami Noon, Paano Kayo Ngayon, that featured a Chinese character played by the martial artist Ching Tong Chai. He's a heroic character in the movie who gives his life protecting the main protagonist, Kulas, played by Christopher De Leon, when the revolution against Spain breaks out. The movie further inspired me to write of fringe characters in our history. The Chinese has long been the invisible person in Philippine society, seen yet not seen, inscrutable, unknown. He lives in the heart of the city, conducting much of the commerce that created a nation, yet is consigned to the periphery of the collective imagination, little more than shadow or caricature. It is a condition that has served both the establishment, which often thrives on corruption related to illicit commercial activity, and which relies on goods and services provided by the merchant class, as well as the Chinese who choose the safety of anonymity. In recent years, there have been a growing number of Philippine writers of Chinese ancestry. Like mine, their memories are not of China, but of Chinatown. We do not have conquering heroes or legendary warriors to celebrate, only merchants, artisans, entrepreneurs. Ours is not a history of conquest or even of mythicized barter, but of occasional persecution and continual accommodation. Recently, after decades of writing fiction in English, I returned to playwriting and wrote a one-act play in Filipino titled Buwis, which will hopefully be staged sometime this year. The main character is an immigrant Chinese widow, and in the play, I finally employ the Chinese Tagalog that I feared using when I was younger. But now, I think the time is right for it. If there are many Englishes, including Filipino English, so there are many variants of Filipino, including that of the immigrant Chinese. In this regard, I think popular movies like the Manopo series has done much to promote inclusivity and cultural awareness among the larger public. In writing, I've always been guided by the 4 M's: myth and memory, magic and metaphor. If you are true to your memories, the myths will reveal themselves. If you serve well your metaphors, the magic will descend. For young writers, write what you know, but also do your research. What you don't know, find out. I write because it is the only way I know how to live. I write the way I do because it is the only way I know how. And like one of my favorite authors, James Baldwin, I think that for while the tale of why we suffer and why we may survive is never new, It always must be told. There is no other tale to tell. It is our only light in all this darkness. I hope this provides you some insight into my writing and will help you in yours. Thank you.